Hello, viewers. Welcome to Uga Media. Uga Media promotes peace, justice, freedom, and democracy. I'm Nagesa Dube. Our guests today are Jennifer Presshold and Ahmed Sirleaf. Jennifer Presshold is a Deputy Director of the Advocates for Human Rights. As a Deputy Director, she assists in fundraising for and directing organizational operations. She also directs International Justice Program, supervising the organization's advocacy at the United Nations and regional human rights mechanisms. Prior to becoming Deputy Director, Presshold practiced asylum law for 7 years and directed organizations' refugee and immigrant program. Presshold has expertise in transitional justice and peace building in post-conflict settings, refugee and immigrant rights, abolition of death penalty, women's human rights, minority rights, and LGBTQ rights. She was a key staff member involved in implementing a 3-year project with the Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission to extend the Commission's work to Liberian diaspora in the US, Europe, and West Africa. Ms. Presshold has also taught international human rights law as an adjunct faculty member at the University of St. Thomas School of Law. Ms. Presshold has BA in Political Science from Yale and Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from Fletcher School, where she studied international human rights law and international refugee policy. She graduated from the University of Minnesota Law School in 1996. I'll go to my second guest. His name is Ahmed Sirleaf. Ahmed is a seasoned international development, human rights, rule of law, and alternative dispute resolution professional with nearly combined 2 decades of experience in planning and managing complex donor transitional justice and international human rights programs. An experienced public speaker, writer, capacity development coach, and currently works on policy questions that inform racial, ethnic reconciliation through transitional justice approaches and policy relations. Ahmed has advised national governments in post-conflict fragile contexts in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere relative to reconciliation and healing using transitional justice mechanisms and rule of law practices. He helped coordinate the diaspora project of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Liberia. As an educator, Ahmed has taught courses in global politics, defense and security, peace building, leadership, and governance at the University of Liberia's Kofi Annan Institute of Conflict Transformation, Capitol Hill, Monrovia. He earned MPA in Global Policy and Planning from the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs, Minneapolis. Ahmed had earlier received MA in Public International Law and Settlement of Disputes from United Nations mandated University for Peace, San Jose, Costa Rica. Prior to graduate school, Ahmed received his university education at Hamlin University in St. Paul, Minnesota, where he earned his BA in Legal Studies with a minor in Conflict Studies. He is currently working his way through doctoral program in Comparative and International Development Education, Department of Organizational Leadership, Policy and Development, University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. His doctoral research rests on aligning donor aid with host countries' development needs through operational learning and adaptive management. Welcome, and it's great to have you.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you.
And Jennifer?
Thanks so much. It's really a privilege to be here with you today to talk about this important topic.
Thank you very much. Jennifer, would you tell our viewers about your organization, the Advocates for Human Rights, what it does in promoting international human rights, civil society, and reinforcing rule of law. With regards to, you can connect to your organization's experience on transitional justice.
Absolutely. So the Advocates for Human Rights is an international human rights organization that's based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the United States. We work on a variety of human rights issues. Locally, we provide legal assistance to people seeking asylum and to survivors of trafficking. But we also work on women's human rights and a variety of other human rights issues internationally. I work with our International Justice Program, which does a lot of international advocacy at the UN and at the regional human rights mechanisms. But transitional justice is one of our priority areas of work, and we've been involved in a number of different transitional justice processes since about 2002. It's kind of interesting for human rights organizations. Many of them did not get involved with transitional justice. They saw it as a post-conflict transitional process when there are massive human rights abuses. But the concern is that, largely based on the experience in South Africa, which had an amnesty process, the concern is that the focus wasn't on accountability. Now we've seen an evolution in that. The advocates, as I said, started working in Peru in 2002, and what we saw was that there are great benefits to using a human rights framework, using a human rights monitoring and other tools to provide recommendations to transitional justice processes in order to create reform to address the human rights violations that often cause the conflict or were, and underpin the conflict in the first place. And also to ensure accountability. So we've seen a lot of evolution, both in our work and also in the field in general. And since 2002, we've worked in Peru and Sierra Leone, in Liberia, which, I think we'll talk a lot more about. We had an MOU with the Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission to carry out their work in the diaspora in the United States, Europe, and in a refugee camp in the sub-region of West Africa. But in addition to that, we have worked with the Colombian truth process most recently, right before the pandemic in 2020, and are currently working on a local level on a local transitional justice effort to address systemic racism and discrimination in the criminal justice system here in the Twin Cities of Minnesota.
Yeah, can I say a little bit how I follow up with Colombia? I know there was armed conflict in Colombia, and if you share us a little bit about that, because there are some similarities in Ethiopia. Also, there is armed confrontation, armed conflict going on.
Mm-hmm.
We thought it will end in 2018 when some rebel groups disarmed. Actually, there were two got disarmed: the Ogaden National Liberating Front and Gimbot Sabat Arbanyot, basically mostly in Amhara region, and the other one is in Somali region of Ethiopia. They two disarmed. Then the Oromo Liberation Front. The leadership, all the three were based in Eritrea. The Oromo Liberation Front, the leadership came back, partially disarmed. Then the other wing continued armed group. And again, the group who were powerful, the group that dominates the central or federal government, the Tigrayan Liberation Front, after lost its hegemony, then it went to confrontation with the federal government. So now we have this, maybe the worst conflict is the one in Tigray, and then there is also another conflict, insurgency in Oromia, rebel groups. So maybe if you can tell us how the armed conflict and then how the transitional, this process went in Colombia.
Sure. And I think, one thing I think it's really important for your viewers to understand is that that there's no one transitional justice process. There have been now more than 40 throughout the world, and each of them is unique to the context of that individual country's experience. And so we can talk a little bit more about what the different elements are of a transitional justice process. And it's not uncommon for a transitional justice process to emerge as part of a peace agreement after a conflict, but it's not a requirement. So just very briefly, the Colombian process, you're exactly right. It was a longstanding armed conflict between non-state actors primarily and the government. But so there were different parties that were involved. A lot of civilians that were harmed and killed over the course of the time. And a very long period. So in setting up their transitional justice process, they were looking at a time period that was more than 50 years of conflict. Now, they decided to create a truth commission process to establish the facts of what happened during that long period and make recommendations for reform. But they chose not to have a reconciliation aspect to that. So what we were talking with them about was how to best bring that truth-telling process to outside of the country, to the diaspora in the United States, because they had millions of Colombians that fled the conflict during that time. And so the process was to collect their stories and then write a report and make recommendations based on those stories.
Okay, thank you very much. So I will go to Ahmed. So, Sirleaf, you're a transitional justice consultant and you advise the national government in post-conflict fragile contexts in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. Can you tell us why we need transitional justice in conflict and post-conflict societies? Under what circumstances do nations conduct it? What is the okay, I will talk to what the advocate's experience is. So you can go ahead, Ahmed.
Okay. Well, thank you, Nagisa and Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Like Jennifer indicated in her introductory comments, every conflict is different and unique, and every country is different and unique. Normally, transitional justice, and to first describe what transitional justice is, as it's a broad umbrella term that describes various mechanisms which countries use to transition from, usually very egregious human rights abuses, violent conflict, to a more normal, peaceful, democratic state of affairs. They use various mechanisms depending on the history and the context of the country. Some conflict, based on the history or what stakeholders may want to do with the conflict, including international stakeholders. It may be national political leaders, political parties. It may even be guerrilla groups that are involved in a conflict, right? Sometimes a transitional justice process emerges out of a peace talk, for instance, a peace agreement, or a national conference of some sort, a national dialogue, or some kind of national composition to at least galvanize consensus around the way forward. And the way forward, oftentimes, perpetrators are trying to sometimes evade accountability. Sometimes others and human rights advocates and other international bodies are trying to hold these perpetrators accountable. At the same time, you have, vast number of victims in the country. And so
I'm going to interrupt you here. So countries have their own criminal justice system. Make criminals accountable. They charge them and they convict them, and there is that transition. I mean, criminal justice, criminal punishment system already in place.
Right. Yeah. So
how is this transitional justice different from the one the countries already have, and why don't we leave it for the criminal justice system that the country already uses?
Very excellent question. So the reason why there's a transition in transitional justice is normally under those circumstances, you have a country that is engaging in extra constitutional activities. And maybe the rule of law has broken down. There's conflicts. The criminal justice system itself may be in question. You know, actors are the legitimacy of actors are questioned. There's a reason why there's a conflict in a particular country, in a particular context. You know, and so if you don't have a central government, for instance, or the central government does not have support across the country because there are various factions, there's conflict in various regions, the country is destabilized in a lot of these instances. And so you cannot go through the normal criminal judicial processes of the national government or of the federal government, or whatever the context may be. As I said, in order to move forward, let's say from a war situation or a very widespread conflict that has brought about widespread human rights abuses across the country, you have to reach some type of agreement, some type of consensus as to how do we move forward, right? For instance, if you have, let's say, 30,000 child soldiers, or you have hundreds of thousands of ex-rebels who you are now trying to disarm. You are now trying to rehabilitate some sort. You're now trying, these are your citizens who were conscripted, who were forced into arms, some who took arms voluntarily, some were forced as children, now they grew up fighting. What are you going to do? You cannot put 100,000 people in jail in your criminal justice system. That alone, do you have the resources or the logistic, or the judicial system may even withstand trying those people, right? That's just an example, maybe on an extreme,
Yeah,
but we see it
exactly.
in many contexts. So you cannot use the criminal justice system to answer your question for various reasons. And so how do you move forward? That's where transitional justice comes in. And I said transitional justice is a broad umbrella term that describes various mechanisms. The popular one people have heard is Truth Commissions, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or some kind of national body that ensures that there's accountability on the one hand, but also there's some kind of reconciliation, healing, and moving forward, some kind of democratization process on the other hand. And so every context, every country, really depending upon the history, depending upon the parties in the conflict, and what stakeholders, where are they in the conflict and what they want to do moving forward, you can make the decision as to whether or not to employ transitional justice, a transitional justice mechanism, or what are a whole host of different transitional justice mechanisms.
Thank you very much. So can you add something on this? Maybe from the advocate's experience, or experience in supporting transitional justice, ending widescreen violations of human rights.
Sure. And I think Ahmed is exactly right that, the transitional justice, the name itself implies that it's, that it's a short-term kind of process for addressing justice needs when the criminal justice system can't or isn't able to provide that kind of accountability. But oftentimes it does intersect with the criminal justice system later on. And so one thing that we've seen in our work at the Advocates, for example, is in Peru, their Truth and Reconciliation Commission made recommendations for prosecutions that at the end of the mandate of that mechanism, the case files were turned over for prosecution, and so that accountability could happen. They were prosecuted within the regular justice system. But other times you see accountability mechanisms that are created so that they can try the crimes out of, using criminal charges that might not be available within the normal criminal justice system. So, things like war crimes and crimes against humanity, that those international criminal law kinds of and humanitarian law kinds of charges. So at the Advocates, we also did some work a few years ago with the Cambodian, there was a hybrid war crimes tribunal that was set up within. It was called the Extraordinary Chambers of the Court of Cambodia, or ECCC, and so that was set up to prosecute those who were most responsible for the massive human rights violations that happened during the Khmer Rouge period in Cambodia. So we were involved there with taking testimony from individuals who had experienced human rights violations, now a long time ago. So actually, just as an aside, we're talking about official transitional justice mechanisms that are set up either by a government or with support from the international community or from the United Nations. But there are also unofficial transitional justice processes, and I do think that that's something important to think about. In the Cambodian experience, for example, the advocates very early in our time as an organization back in the 80s, the Cambodian community here in Minnesota came to the organization in the 80s and said, we want to do a mock war crimes tribunal. And that was held here. Later, that the individuals who testified at that mock war crimes tribunal, which was held at the Minnesota State Capitol back in the 1980s, later they were, I was involved with them just about 5 years ago with actually, collecting their testimonies in a way that could be used in the real war crimes tribunal that eventually was set up.
Okay.
And if I may, Jennifer said something very important. We need to be very clear about that. Transitional justice can be judicial and non-judicial. There are some crimes in order to hold people accountable, you have to go through a retributive justice process. You have to establish some kind of war crimes, it could be that we've seen different variation. Sometimes an internationalized tribunal, which means it's national component, but there are internationals. It could be international judges and lawyers with national, the hybrid model, but there has to be some kind of judicial process where you hold people accountable for egregious human rights violations on the judicial level. On the non-judicial side, there are various other mechanisms, more than just truth commission, for instance, where you can employ in order to meet various transitional justice goals.
Yeah. So I have these two. While I was researching here, I found out that there is a country that was holding transitional justice mechanism, but I think it's Albania, or I don't know if it's Albania, but it was not for human rights violations, but mostly for corruptions. It's a widespread corruption, and they were holding. There were some killings, but the main reason why they are holding transitional justice is to fight corruption. So sometimes there are also that aspect, I think. I don't know if that country is Albania or Armenia. Armenia, maybe. I think Armenia. Yeah, Armenia. So the other issue I wanted here is, so it's not like complete amnesty, and it's not also only criminal justice, like it's not only retributive on one hand. So is it like a balance of the two? Can we say that's what it is? Or like from both?
Yeah, maybe Ahmed, do you want to just talk about the main functions? And again, every single experience has been different, and so it's up to the people that are involved or survivors of the conflict to figure out what is the thing that is most beneficial for their community to move forward. But yeah, maybe Ahmed, you want to just talk about the general.
Yes, thank you. I think it's important to lay the premise to define some of the well-known or well utilized mechanisms of transitional justice. Um, and before I do that, corruption is a driver of conflict. So what we're really focusing on is when you have widespread conflict or violence or human rights violations, how do you move your country from that total destruction or maybe chaos to a place where it can have democratic elections, it can have institutions, rule of law in place, and things like that to prevent massive human rights violations. Transitional justice, we've seen in various contexts different mechanisms utilized. So, for example, in order to heal, in order to bring about racial unity and be able to move forward, when in 1994, President Mandela was elected, right, in South Africa. They decided that they were not going to throw everybody in jail. They decided that they were not going to disband the South African police force that have been enforcing apartheid rule, right? What did they do? They decided to reform institutions that had been institutions of abuse, right? So sometimes you actually reform, institutional reform is a major component of how to move forward. Those institutions may be mostly security institutions, but sometimes it's the judiciary, sometimes it's the political system. You may want to honor victims. Maybe set up a memorial system where you memorialize people, major massacres, and remember things that have happened so that the nation doesn't forget. So you engage in that sort of national shock therapy to help people recognize what happened in this country, what's wrong. Sometimes it's about reparation, giving back to populations, giving back to marginalized or minority or minoritized communities that may have been victimized collectively or individually. And sometimes it's about engaging in psychosocial sort of psychotherapy work to help people come to terms with losses, to help people get to a place where they're able to move forward. So those are the restorative aspect, right? So you have restorative justice component where you give perpetrators an opportunity to be held accountable for their crimes, maybe give back to their community. We saw in Rwanda the gacaca process, a traditional mechanism where a local community member who violated their very own local people, they come and do something for the local community and confess to their crime and apologize and be really regretful and contrite. But because you can, try 200 or a million people in your fragile judicial system, you have to be able to have something to hold people accountable on the one hand, at the same time, help them reintegrate in their community peacefully, successfully, and heal. So the various mechanisms, sometimes you compensate people, sometimes you bar certain leaders of what may have led to the conflict from participating in national government. It's called lustration. So you make sure, if part of this deal is that you don't run for office so that the victims don't continue to see your face and hear your voice, you have to be able to give back to your community in a way. So there's a restorative component, and two, there's a retributive or criminal aspect of it, where we talk about criminal tribunals, hybrid, internationalized. Jennifer just talked about the Cambodian high courts, where they use the Cambodian existing judicial system and created a layer whereby they can try former Khmer Rouge violators of that conflict. In Rwanda, they established the Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, former Yugoslavia. They established the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. Sierra Leone, the United Nations was invited by the Sierra Leonean government, where they established the International Criminal Tribunal, the special court for Sierra Leone, where Sierra Leonean lawyers and judges, alongside international lawyers and judges, were able to try perpetrators, mostly those with the highest responsibilities of the crime. So the various mechanisms of transitional justice that we're describing here, sort of with broad strokes, but it again just depends on the context. It depends on the conflict. You can institute a process for corruption. If corruption is so endemic that corruption is now a driver of conflict in your country, Maybe that's what you want to address. So it depends on the goals. It depends on what mandate you give what transitional justice mechanism.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary, and I just want to pick up on one thread of that, and that has to do with the victims and the survivors, and the goal of creating an accurate history of what happened during a conflict. That truth telling function is very often part of it. And it's definitely something that I have seen in the work that I've done, that it's been really important to create that space. And when we were working in Peru, for example, there were massive human rights violations, extrajudicial killings that were happening up in the highlands in Peru, in remote areas. And so part of their process was to exhume. In the end, they did 3 mass graves, and it was just really important for the family members to finally know what happened to their loved ones, and to be able to do a solemn, procession and funeral, to be able to finally have that, know what happened, and be able to bury their loved ones. So that's really important. Also, the work, with the Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which Ahmed and I both worked on, so we can talk a lot more about the details of, or the actual mechanics of running a transitional justice process. But in that process, part of what we were doing was collecting statements from individuals that had survived human rights abuses in Liberia, and also their stories of what happened after they were forced to flee Liberia, either to a refugee camp or again to the United States or to Europe. But in that context, it was really I really came to understand the importance of giving that space to victims and survivors to be able to share their stories of what happened, and to honor their loved ones. So we, in the end, we took more than 1,600 statements from individuals as part of that truth-telling process, and all of those statements went back to Liberia. But the goal was then to sort of create an accurate history of what happened during that conflict. And I think, without that firsthand information, it's impossible to, actually have that accurate history, which then could, history books can be rewritten. And that's one way to prevent the human rights violations from happening again in the future.
Okay. Some of the most known countries that experienced massive and systematic human rights violations started the process of transitional justice are like South Africa, Chile, Sierra Leone, Argentina, Rwanda. As you said, Liberia was one of them, and former Yugoslavia. Can you share with us the success stories of the countries that succeeded with transitional justice and the countries failed? And if you can also share us, tell our viewers why some succeed and why some fail. You can go one after the other.
Okay, yeah, we could probably go back and forth.
Yeah. That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, the context is really important, because some transitional justice mechanisms are set up. Their mandate is set up to be a very short term, maybe just to investigate one specific incident. So I think that there's successes and challenges in every transitional justice experience. I think that Peru is known for being one that is usually seen as being a successful one, in part because they were able to, successfully prosecute after the fact some of the individuals that were most responsible for those conflict, those conflict actors. So that's one example. Now, the challenges, of course, are, what do you do if there's not political will to do that? So I think that that's one place where transitional justice mechanism or processes often fall down, if there's not a clear plan for the accountability phase. So in Liberia, for example, the Liberian TRC also made recommendations for prosecutions, and more than 10 years on, there hasn't been a single prosecution in Liberia. There have been outside of Liberia under universal jurisdiction, but certainly not in Liberia. So that's a one example of kind of the positives and so having the plan at the outset for how that accountability will happen. I think another challenge for many transitional justice mechanisms is that they're created when given a very limited mandate, 2 years, 3 years, a time period, and then they're supposed to go away. And so I think one thing I've seen is that it takes a while. The outreach piece, the
Yeah,
engagement piece can take
yeah,
a long time, and even the mechanism itself getting up to speed with hiring people, and they're almost set up to fail with not with having this limited time period. So the more successful ones that have been where they maybe have a more limited mandate where they just are investigating a very concrete kind of thing. I don't know, Ahmed, what do you think?
No, I think you summarize it really well, Jennifer. Even in Liberia right now, the reports, various aspects of the report are sources of political tensions. When you talk about establishing war and economic crimes court in Liberia, which the commission recommended very clearly, it's a big political source of tension. The low hanging fruits, as they say, establish palaver hot processes across the country. So the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf administration, for example, sort of engaged in that sort of, I would say, whitewashing semblances of, we're implementing the TRC report and so on. But if you look at academic literature, they try to measure or examine transitional justice successes and failures. They talk about just like and for good reasons, some of which Jennifer has articulated here. The mere fact that a truth commission can begin its work and complete its work and issue a report, that is an accomplishment in and of itself, because we've seen in some contexts, say the Philippines, for instance, or Ecuador, I think it was, I'll try to remember the country, where the commissions ended early because of lack of political support, political will, and lack of financial support, basically to strangle the commission so that it couldn't keep going after the witnesses that it was going after, usually perpetrators. If the commission is able to reach victims, and really if it's such a, say a, I'm assuming that transitional justice process is a truth commission. This, in my example, if that such a commission can reach out to as many victims as possible, give them that platform to hear their stories, collect their stories, give them that national platform so they know they're not alone, so they hear others' stories. In the literature, scholars say that in and of itself is the mark of success. That those who argue that a truth commission or transitional justice process can also enact further conflict if not done properly, right? Say, because of what Jennifer said, they usually it's very short-term mandate. It's a temporal mandate from this period to this period, and then you got to do this work 2 years, 3 years. Sometimes they do that, and now they've exposed all these victims to the stories, and they've talked about their abusers and the perpetrators. Now the perpetrators knows that these victims are speaking, so that exposes victims to further, trauma and even further threats and risk. On the one hand, on the other hand, perpetrators is supposed to give them to an opportunity to be held accountable, to apologize, to move forward, right? To reconcile, integrate. If that is not done properly, now they're exposed. They could even go back and try to harm, so there's that tension from the victim side, from the perpetrator side. So it's really a mixed bag. What we've seen as success stories, you can argue in South Africa, they needed to do that racial reconciliation component so that those who are abusing others, their own families and friends, can actually see them for who they are. And so that this can serve as a deterrence to others, that you can shame people. You can name powerful people. You can somebody you've regarded and respected as your husband, your father, your brother, that they've been torturing others. They've been, engaging in extrajudicial killings and so on. So a truth commission, for instance, as a process of transitional justice can really serve various functions. I think the design of it, the mandate you give it, how broad is that mandate, how well it's funded, how well it's supported politically and socio-culturally across the country. That's where, I think therein lies a possibility of success in any particular context.
All right. Oh,
That when for those that have had a reconciliation process or component built in, the Rwanda experience with the Gacaca courts generally have been perceived as being a successful reconciliation process. So it was, kind of using or traditional justice systems that were already in place as an add-on. And I think the Palava Hut process that Ahmed mentioned in Liberia, unfortunately, I don't know that it was able to reach as many people as perhaps wanted to contribute. But again, engaging with a traditional, culturally relevant process to try to reach more people.
all right. So we in Ethiopia have this experience, like mostly when there is a regime change, the new government takes the justice in its hand. I mean, take action on previous officials of previous government. Like in 1974, before 1974, we have a monarchy system of uh, government, monarchy. So in 1974, the soldiers, junta, military junta took over. It's like a coup d'etat. Then they killed the monarch, and then they assassinated about more than 60, between 60 and 70 ministers. And mostly the kind of justice was retributive, like they, it's more of uh, clearly um, what do you call this when you, it's retributive, whatever. So they revenge, okay. So they revenge on a previous officials of the previous regime. So it's not like, it doesn't follow legal procedures in most cases. Then after 1974, rebel group came to power in 1991. So this rebel group, somehow they didn't assassinate the previous officials. Actually, they dismantled all the government security apparatus. They replaced it with the rebel, with their own members. So the national army was dispersed. They instituted a new one of their army, and the intelligence and everything. They did new, and they restructured the country in a federal setting. They made a new constitution that enacted in 1995, and then they did bring previous officials to court, but mostly that process was not independent or whatever. It has this element of retribution in itself. So whatever the case, but they took them through court process. The process took like more than 20 years. I know they were imprisoned in 1991, and throughout, when I go to prison in 2005, 2004, those officials were in prison. I met them in prison. So until I was released in 2007, they were in prison. I mean, they were charged of rape, terror, some some killings like genocide. So they were only convicted after that. By the time, even in from 1991 2007, they were not convicted. Maybe 2010, 2009, 10, or some like it took these long years to even to get convicted, and some of them already got old. Some died in prison. Some and the previous leader Mengistu Haile Mariam, he fled to Zimbabwe. He lived there, but the court sentenced him to death penalty or life imprisonment. I don't know. It's life imprisonment. I think ex parte at his absence. So then, due to popular movement and we got to transition in 2008. The former prime minister resigned and new came to power. We were hoping for a better here transitional justice, but then the people who dominate the government for the last 27 years didn't want to face justice. They felt like it's retributive, not. They don't believe there is a independent. They know how they were operating, and they felt that this government will operate the same way and revenge on them. So they ran away into their region. They organized their youth and whatever. They already have a big army, and so they started to fight against the federal government. And there is also already another. So we are in this situation. So having given you this background, as I already said, Ethiopia's transition began in 2018 after former Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn resigned, and Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was sworn in. Though reforms stirred hope at home and abroad initially, it exacerbated tensions. Efforts to dismantle the old order have weakened the Ethiopian state and pushed it to civil war. It exacerbated its ethnic strife. So the road is not easy. It's rather bumpy. Ethiopia is struggling to end the civil war and violence taking place in different parts of the country. Recently, Ethiopian government announced that it would conduct a national dialogue as a post-conflict transitional justice mechanism. What is your advice to strengthen the efforts to foster inclusive dialogue on a multiple tracks in Ethiopia? You can share with us the experience of other countries who conducted this kind of dialogue. What are preconditions or conditions stakeholders need to meet? I know this kind of dialogue have brought a success in Tunisia and countries like Tunisia is the best example, next to South Africa, and I think Mali also has got some better outcome out of it. Mali holds this transition, this inclusive national dialogue as a result of terrorist actions here and there, and I think it improved somehow the situation. So you can share us whatever you have.
Well, what I hear is a description of decades of pain, a decades of various episodes of the Ethiopian experience of conflict, of ethnic national distrust, and so clearly there's a need for healing. There's a need for really reconciling the different stories, the different histories, the different aspects of victimhood and abuse and violence. So in that respect, it's very similar to what happened to my own country, Liberia. There were various stages, just like you've described similarly, of different types, different episodes of our conflicts and political upheavals and the coup and uh, sort of democratic movement that resulted into political violence. There were assassinations and then rebel war that brought about multiple different factions, political divisions, and so on. So that has happened in many other contexts. You look in the Balkans, you look in South Africa, what they've experienced. So a context is important. Again, we come back to that. And so national dialogue is just a name that different contexts give different things. In my country, we conducted what's called the All Liberian National Conference. In Sierra Leone, they had the Sierra Leonean National Conference, and they held that in Sierra Leone and different parts of the world where there were the Sierra Leonean citizens. Significant number of Sierra Leonean citizens. We did that in Liberia. The idea is to galvanize consensus around a way forward. So in Ethiopia, you may be engaging in national dialogue. I mean, I can't sit here and armchair, advise you and play experts. I do not know anything about Ethiopia. I do not know your history. I don't know the political issues you've been dealing with other than reading in the media, talking to friends, and so on, right? But you are an Ethiopian. You've described it to us. It sounds very familiar, given other contexts that we've worked with and have seen and read about, worked with. What is important, however, to say for me, at least from my perspective, is people have to be honest. If it's the government that is organizing this, you have to bring stakeholders of all sectors, be they important ethnic groups that may have participated in different aspects of the conflict that you've described. It may be the security sector. It may have been different elements of different past government structures or administration and so on. You have to go back in history from 1974 or even beyond, because there are threats you've described, those who uh, were thrown in prison, maybe trump up charges, who knows, for political reasons. They died in prison. They got stay in prison for over 30 plus 40 years, and their children, their grandchildren know this story. They have that in their hearts. Uh, those who came 1991, 1994, you've described, and those 2018. So you can't just say, all right, let's just move on with a truth commission. You have to know why. I will say, and to know why, you have to be honest. I'm using the you. It could be the government. It could be the government really being honest and bringing on board all critical elements and stakeholders, and go across the countries, across various regions, and seek consensus and describe to people in their language, in the way they understand. As a country, we have to make progress. A lot of hurts have happened. So many people got hurt across the country. So we want to move forward now. There are various possibilities. Let us have a conversation about which way you think will work best for you, for your purposes to move forward. I think a national dialogue is a good idea, but it has to be sincere. It has to be well funded. It has to be thorough. It has to be done well. Bring some international people, other Africans who have experience in their own context, people like Jennifer, people like, who know these mechanisms, and to really sit and listen and learn your stories and work with you to build up what is it that you want to do to bring your country from a brink of further chaos to a place where it can build and be prosperous. Because Ethiopia is a very strategic country to Africa. Has the headquarters of the African Union, the East African Commission, is the major international organizations, the United Nations. So we can sit and let it see continue to slide into further and further chaos.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I completely agree that it's really important that it be a sincere, like a genuine process, in order to have that national dialogue. And so often you see governments, particularly in a post-conflict peace agreement kind of situation, where they're just doing it to paper over the problems, or to and later on, some of the conflict actors might say, oh, well, we didn't actually mean that, there should be accountability when we signed that peace agreement. So it should be something that is genuine, and not just on paper, or not just for the international community. But I think it would also be really important to engage all sides. So So all of the sides, all the different ethnic groups, the affected communities, in a lot of the South American and Central American transitional justice processes, the mothers of the disappeared were really influential in pushing the process forward. So making sure that those communities of the families and victims are included, and that they have support, that they have psychosocial support to be able to participate, and that there's not retribution for coming forward, so that you won't be, so the individuals have a chance to, they know about it, have a chance to participate in the national dialogue, and that they won't be punished for participating, for speaking their minds. And I also think that it would be important to, as part of the national dialogue, to find out what people think about the next steps. And that should help define a mandate for whatever kind of transitional justice process is created afterwards. So, questions about what time period should be looked at. Are you going back to 1974? Or are you just looking at, a shorter time period? What are the goals of the transitional justice process? Is it something like justice and accountability in prosecutions? Is it institutional reform? Is it reparations, whether they're collective reparations or individual reparations? Those are the kinds of things that it would be helpful to hear from the people about what they think would actually move the country forward and promote peace and prevent human rights abuses in the future.
Thank you. It's so one last point I wanna raise is how is if you can relate the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to the national dialogue. Does it come out? Does this come first or after, or it all depends? And my other point that I want you to recommend on or have your say is, can the advocates or SERLEF assist in this process if invited by Ethiopian federal or regional government? Yeah.
So the national dialogue process, as I understand it, to me, it sounds like a precursor to another, so first step in a transitional justice process, at least the way that it has worked in other countries. Do you agree, Ahmed, or do you want to add anything there?
Yes, I do agree. Like I was saying, in some contexts, is national conference. I think yes, it's if it's done really well, it's a precursor. It's explaining to people the need to move forward and seeking their opinions and their needs, understanding their needs, bringing everybody on board, not leaving critical communities out. In a way, it's a sort of transitional justice mechanism already you are engaging in. You're acknowledging that something is happening in the country that's not right, that we can't continue to be this way. So we are one people. Let's have a conversation. Let's have a dialogue. And dialogue is about understanding, exchange of views and ideas about this particular one thing that's happening, right? So yeah, you want to do that and do that well, so that then you take that and say, well, what do we do with what we've heard from the people? Because in a transitional justice process, is particularly if it's a truth commission process, Jennifer mentioned earlier, that storytelling component, listening to victims, understanding what happened to them, the breadth of the crimes and the hurts, the violation that and so on. Maybe you're not going in depth in those with this national dialogue. National dialogue to me seems like a political process. It's a sort of political transition conversation, trying to bring people aboard, at least to a point where they'll be willing to sit down and talk with others whom they've seen as enemies or as abusers and so on. The government that they may see is abusing them, violating their rights or not protecting them. So in that respect, you can't say, well, maybe let's have a truth commission process or transitional justice process first. A dialogue, a consensus seeking, in some contexts, true is peace talk. It's important, it's necessary, but it cannot happen without everybody. You can't leave certain stakeholders out and do that. So it's important to do that because you have to understand the problems first, which you try to address. Now, then you set a goal for how to address this problem. Some of that goal may include a transitional, further deeper transitional justice process, well thought out. Why this mechanism over this other one? Why this one? Why not that? How do we do it? What sort of mandate do we give such a process? How do we fund it? Do we have the political will and backing, and really do it well if you mean well, if you want to move forward. Question whether you get involved or not. Listen, there's so many experts and practitioners in various countries who have dealt with this in their own countries, who work on this 24/7. Ethiopia is such an important country. I'm sure if you wanted to involve anybody, the Advocates for Human Rights, a big international organization that does work with the UN in other countries, you will have a lot of help. Me as a sub-Saharan African myself, I want to see Ethiopia stable. I want to see Ethiopia successful. I will do anything in my own little power to make that successful. But you don't have a problem of not having people who can come and listen to you and stand besides you to help you make the progress you need to make.
Yeah, well said. And then just to add, the Advocates has supported a number of transitional justice mechanisms with technical assistance and training. It just is a sort of case by case basis on what is needed and what we can do in terms of reviewing protocols or planning or, as I said, training about how to actually implement. With the Liberian TRC, that was our biggest project. As I said, we operated under an MOU with the Liberian TRC. That we actually had to get significant funding in order to be able to support all of the work that we did. But we also had the budget for that project was. It was about 500,000 over 3 years, but we were able to leverage more than $10 million in pro bono resources. So we had hundreds of volunteers that were taking the statements and were not being paid. They were volunteering their time to sit with statement givers and document their stories. When we did the public hearings, everything was donated for that. The space, the film crew that was recorded the entire week of hearings. So there are ways to sort of to leverage the many resources that are available and the interest that's available in the West to support these transitional justice processes.
No, Nagit, just one point that I would be remiss if I didn't mention or encourage you is the Ethiopian diaspora. Every country in Africa, countries like Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, those are big and powerful countries in Africa whose diaspora populations are so well connected, so well educated, so well powerful. Sometimes we overlook diaspora populations, and they're the ones who can fuel the conflict, and they're the ones who can help to tame down the conflict also and sap the negative energy out of it or infuse or trigger the negative. Why? Because they have connections internationally. On top of their education, they may have reason. I'm not saying Ethiopia, you don't have connections there and educated people. You're a big, powerful country. Your GDP is one of the highest on the continent, and so you're a very well resourced and educated population, and kudos to you. However, your diaspora population, I imagine, is such a large and powerful component that you want to include in your national dialogue. You want to make sure that I don't know how they're structured in the Liberian. We're a small country, but our diaspora population is structured along different lines, and it can be very radical at times, right? And so to Sierra Leonean diaspora and others that I've engaged with, I just want to say that whatever national process is happening, if you leave the people outside, sometimes those outside is spoilers, are the ones who can call and talk to their relatives in the villages and say, don't do it. Are the ones who can say, go for it. Are the ones who can call that politician and say, you're not going to do that because you will not have my support. Or you have to do this for the sake of the country, no matter how bitter it may be. So I just want to say, whatever process you're engaged with, there's strong, powerful stakeholders at home, but also that those strong, powerful stakeholders outside of the country that you want to pay attention to?
Yeah, thank you very much. We actually the problem we, especially our diaspora, have is uh, that problem exists back home too. But the diaspora is divided along with ethnic bases.
Mm-hmm.
You don't find the Amharic speaking diaspora and the Oromo speaking diaspora come together in one meeting, like totally separated. Within Oromo diaspora, you find that those who support the current government and those who doesn't support, of course, the current government are totally, and those who there are diaspora who back the insurgent, the rebel group, so they fund that, and then so people sometimes like they make clear line like friend and enemy line, and uh, I mean,
Yeah, the conflict continues even outside of the country, and
yeah,
Ethiopia
yeah,
is not
yeah,
alone in this
yeah, yeah.
experience. But I still agree with Ahmed that it is important that any kind of national transitional justice process, including this national dialogue, include
So what is
both
in why
ethnic.
I make this dialogue is what is in people's mind is the trend. So what people think is just overthrow the current government and then everything will be okay. But it happened 3, 4 times. Things were not okay. So I want people to think other ways of
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
doing things. So if every group thinks if I'm not I there are human rights abuses or whatever this government is committing, and if our focus is only we fix things by overthrowing this one, and the new one also will not do the same. I mean, may do the same. I mean, may not be better than this. Then things will continue like that. So I wanted to just people get some experience. That's why I wanted you guys to share your experiences of other countries, and so that yeah, I'll use this platform to engage people, and we'll see what come out.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. The ethnic division in Africa is our age-old problem. On top of our artificial colonial legacy of division of people in different countries and borders, um, it's a difficult thing because people can be more loyal to their ethnic group than to their national government or to their own
Exactly.
country at times.
Exactly. We the diaspora were united for 2 3 years just before the transition to the new prime minister before 2018. That was only united against the TPLF. Then immediately after a while, and people were excited when new prime minister came to power for about a year. Then people get back to their corners, and because the expectation was very high, the government cannot meet that expectation, and then uh, so you find a lot of factions here and there, and
Mhm.
so but it needs to work.
Right.
I mean, yeah, yeah, it's a lot of work. So thank you
Maybe
very much.
part of maybe part of the national dialogue is cross-ethnic, inter-ethnic infusion, find opportunities, entry points across ethnic lines to get people together and more often to have certain understanding. It's difficult. In Liberia, we have many tribes with, people are divided along county lines, like this sub-regional organization, places of origin, alumni association, schools you attended back home, and then your ethnic tribal associations. But we've managed to have a national, it's called Union of Liberian Association in the Americas. Liberia is a small country, so we can't even put it in the context of Ethiopia in that way. But other countries I've seen, Sierra Leoneans, they have the Sierra Leone Association in Minnesota, for instance. Then they have a diaspora one. There's a global Nigerian union of something. Of course, you have the Yoruba, the Hausa, the Igbo groups. That it can be complicated, but find a way. If you're talking about the nation, your country, find a way to come
Yeah,
political lines and ethnic lines.
yeah, we have a lot of problems because within some ethnic in Ethiopia, there are a lot of, like, there are some who believe that who need independent states to secede from Ethiopia, and then, for example, within Oromo group, and there are other within Tigray also. There some kind of that they're not on the same page. Within Oromo also, they're not on the same page, and then there is this tendency of, like, if you don't support what I support, you your enemy. I don't talk to you. And if you support, assume assume I support the government. And the other group will feel, oh, and I guess I support the killer, and then he is a part of the killer, and I don't want to talk to him. And then other group would say, the rebels are killers and they commit genocide against my tribe, and then they support these rebels. Or there is some person they hate, and these people support that person, so we don't want to talk to them and their enemy. And so there is all this kind of division, but still, if people can look at the bigger picture to bring peace, and things can improve. And maybe this platform and the dialogue would a little bit open that space, create some space for people to make conversation, to make dialogue, and a little bit to make people talk, at least get close together.
Right. Like, what will it take to actually move Ethiopia forward? What will it take?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for being here, and have a wonderful time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hopefully we will make another dialogue if you guys, especially the truth and reconciliation process. I would like to have some conversation on that.
There's plenty to talk about, so we're happy to help.
Thank you for the conversation today. I hope we've contributed our little quota to
a lot. I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. Have a good day.
You too.